Well, the federal government's deal with Alberta drove Stephen Guilbeault to resign from cabinet yesterday, and sources tell CBC News that some BC Liberal MPs have also expressed concerns over this MOU. British Columbia New Democrat MP Gord Johns called out those BC MPs today.
Did you see a BC Liberal here today? No, I didn't either. And so, I think it sends a message, hopefully, to Mark Carney that his love-in with the Alberta UCP isn't going to go well in British Columbia. And not a single BC Liberal was in the House of Commons today. So I think that sends a message. And maybe they shouldn't be hiding. They should be showing up and standing here in front of you and answering questions.
Okay, so are BC Liberal MPs hiding? Well, Taleeb Noormohamed doesn't seem to be. He is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of AI and Digital Innovation, also the Liberal MP for Vancouver-Granville in British Columbia, and he's here with me now. Taleeb Noormohamed, it's good to see you, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, David. Good to see you.
I wonder what you make of that criticism from your New Democrat colleague, Gord Johns, suggesting that there's a little bit of fear amongst the backbench right now.
Well, I have a lot of respect for Gord. I consider him a friend. And if Gord had done his homework, he would know that the majority of BC caucus was actually at a summit on extortion with law enforcement, with local mayors, with chiefs of police, with the RCMP, which is a huge issue, as you know, in British Columbia. And we're working hard as a team to ensure that all levels of government, all levels of policing are there. And so if Gord had done his homework, he'd know that all of us were there having those difficult conversations with victims of extortion, as well as with the police of jurisdiction and, of course, with mayors and provincial officials, including the Premier.
Right. Okay. So the Premier was at that summit. The Premier's also going to be meeting with the Natural Resources Minister, Tim Hodgson, either now or within the hour, as I understand it. There's some mending of relationship that needs to happen. What does Minister Hodgson need to say to the BC government today?
I think, look, Minister Hodgson has a difficult file and is doing the work that is required. He's here in British Columbia to meet with the province. We have major projects that are being advanced, right? The majority of the major projects that are being advanced by the Major Projects Office are here in British Columbia. Two big ones, as we know, Red Chris, the big mine, as well as North Coast Transmission. These are going to be transformative for the economy in British Columbia. And, the Premier spoke about those in his availability. And the Minister and the Premier, I suspect, will talk about how do we make sure that those projects remain on track, that the work that British Columbians need for all of us to be doing to advance those projects is done in an intentional and thoughtful way. And those two projects, look, any project that comes through MPO, those are two major examples of ensuring that the jurisdiction in question, as well as First Nations, are actively engaged and have given their consent for these things to move forward.
What does the minister and the other leadership in the government need to do to keep the BC caucus on track? I talked to a lot of your colleagues this week who are concerned about the lack of communication, the lack of detail, and then some of the detail that was in this particular agreement. Where do you think the 20 Liberal MPs from British Columbia are at the end of this week?
Well, I think where Liberal MPs are at the end of this week in British Columbia is we're united behind a Prime Minister, and we're united behind a government that believes that you can build a strong economy, that you can diversify our economy and our trading partners while also respecting climate change, while also doing the hard work to ensure that we are protecting our natural environment, working in partnership with Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities and with provinces. And that is what you are going to see from our caucus. We are united. We may have different points of view in respect of some of the specific substantive questions in the MOU, and that's for all of us to work together on. But we are fundamentally united in what we are trying to achieve, which is a strong economy in the face of some very, very difficult economic times. And with the battle that we're having with the United States on tariffs has only emphasized the need for us to be able to be not just pragmatic, but thoughtful for the long term in terms of the kind of economy we build at home and how we trade abroad.
Right. But are you comfortable, are your BC caucus colleagues comfortable with the idea of a bitumen pipeline through the Great Bear Rainforest to the north coast of British Columbia, and with the changes to things like the tanker ban? Because these have been issues you ran on in the past as a party and as a government that are now potentially on the table for removal.
Well, David, I think what Liberal members of Parliament from British Columbia and across the country are comfortable with is a process that requires the participation of Indigenous communities, that ensures that jurisdictions implicated are part of that process and conversation, that we are working together to ensure that the criteria that have been set by the Prime Minister are met. And I think, when we are talking about a theoretical pipeline, as the Premier herself noted, that doesn't have a route, that doesn't currently have a proponent, that doesn't currently have the support, or has not yet gone through the process of getting the support of jurisdictions in question as well as First Nations. I mean, this is a theoretical conversation right now. And our job should be to focus on the practical. The practical is making sure that the process to do those things is done correctly, to have conversations about major projects in a way that we have articulated. Anything that goes through the Major Projects Office to be referred has to have the consent of the jurisdictions in question, has to have the consent of First Nations. And right now, you know, these are all, we have an MOU that is an outline, a roadmap to have a further conversation.
Right. Look, I get that the pipeline at this point has no proponents, so it's technically theoretical, but the opposition to it is not. It's long-standing and it's entrenched. And knowing that, I just wonder how you feel that the government is proceeding with this, because I'm sure you're hearing from your constituents, as I hear other members of your caucus are, that they do not like this idea, and this is going to be unpopular with voters next time.
Well, I think, you know, we are all hearing from our constituents, as we do on these very difficult, complex issues. And, you know, look, I can tell you for certain that constituents in my riding have expressed their views very, very strongly. And our job is to make sure those views are reflected. And what my constituents consistently say is that for these types of things to happen, you have to have the consent of First Nations. Coastal First Nations are a critical component of how we make consideration in this province. I mean, Section 35 rights are a big part of how we do things in this country, and British Columbia is going to be at the table because they're a partner. But this is, again, all theoretical right now. And the practical reality for anything coming to the table or anything coming to the fore requires that these conditions and these expectations, these requirements are actually met by any proponent of any major project. And if you look at the two that I referred to earlier, you look at Red Chris and you look at North Coast Transmission, these were two projects that had the consent and had the support of the jurisdictions in question, active First Nations participation, responsible and environmental guidelines around them, and that's why they were able to move forward. And the standard is clear, and anyone who wants to bring a project forward needs to, for whatever that project is, the standards for Major Projects Office is crystal clear, and there is no compromise on those things.
Well, Stephen Guilbeault's resignation was not theoretical. It was an actual departure from cabinet based on the rolling back of climate policies. And people who work for your party on elections and people who run for office in your province are worried about the impact of all of these things in terms of changing the electoral map in Quebec and certainly in the lower mainland of British Columbia where you are now. And it's a lot of three-way fights or two-way fights with the NDP. How worried are you about a political cost, if not to you, to maybe some of your colleagues?
Well, first a word about Stephen, who is a dear friend and somebody who has fought tirelessly as a Liberal to make sure that Canada is a leader in climate. And the fact that he's staying in our caucus to continue that work alongside all of us to ensure that we continue to lead on climate change is in my view, a sign of his leadership and a sign of the value of the voice that he has on this. And I think that all of us should be grateful that Stephen has done the work that he's done, but more importantly, that he's staying part of the team. But look, as it relates to how we deal with this now going forward, I think Canadians in all of our ridings here in British Columbia understand the importance of having a Prime Minister that is able to deal with complexity, deal with complex issues, and requires that in order to make big things happen, that we move boldly, but that we also have the right steps in place and the right processes and safeguards and guardrails in place. Look, you're dealing with if you look at the choice that people had, right? You have Pierre Poilievre, who is without any consideration for the environment, without any consideration for Indigenous rights, certainly without any consideration for British Columbia, saying, build whatever the heck you want and we'll just deal with the consequences later. That's not a thoughtful approach. That is not a Canadian approach. The Canadian approach is to say, we are going to have active, thoughtful discussions about how we get things done. And if at the end of that process there is a path forward, then we will look at that path forward. But right now, no approvals have been given. There is no sort of proponent for some of these things. And if you talk about the broader picture on the environment, David, and I think this is really, really important, this is the first time that Alberta has come to the table and agreed to methane regulations. This is the first time that Alberta has agreed to an approval process for projects that will mirror and use federal standards. I mean, these are big deals. The fact that we're going to be looking at a viable market for carbon, these are real steps forward that are important. Getting pathways built is an important step forward. So these are all things that are going to happen in the short term. And by the way, on the clean energy regulations, there is a 4-month period during which the Minister of the Environment, not the Minister of Natural Resources, nobody else, the Minister of the Environment has to be satisfied with the deal that is struck. And between now and April 1st, Alberta and the federal government have to get that deal done. If that deal doesn't get done, this doesn't happen. And so that's an important step that everybody needs to realize is a big part of what needs to happen before we can even move forward.
Okay, Taleeb Noormohamed, we're out of time. There's a lot more I want to talk to you about there, but we've got to let you go. Thank you as BC Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary Taleeb Noormohamed. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, David.
Well, BC Premier David Eby says he has anxiety over Alberta's proposed pipeline and what it could mean for other multi-billion-dollar projects.
It has already become, and I'm worried that it will continue to be, an energy vampire that sucks federal time and money, that sucks Indigenous government time and energy, and our government's time and energy at the expense of very real major projects. The federal government needs to be extremely careful to make sure that their efforts with Alberta don't put those projects at significant risk.
Eleanor Olszewski is the minister responsible for Prairies Economic Development. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice, Minister. Thank you so much for being here in a busy week. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it, David.
You can see Danielle Smith trying to celebrate and sell this deal to a skeptical, I would say, membership of the United Conservative Party. You see the frustration in British Columbia. It's led to the resignation of one of your cabinet colleagues. Is this deal worth it if a pipeline is theoretical?
Absolutely it is. And the memorandum of understanding that was agreed upon between Premier Smith and the Prime Minister really, as my colleague Taleeb Noormohamed pointed out, sets out a framework. So a set of conditions that will enable other steps to be taken. And they're matters that were a source of irritation and frustration for people that want some certainty and some investment predictability. And so certainly from an economic perspective, I think that the agreement not only strengthens our economy and our sovereignty, really, but also leads to incredible opportunities for people that work in the oil sands and other related industries in the province of Alberta. It allows us to diversify our exports from the United States to other willing customers. And, you know, David, I was actually in Calgary yesterday, and I had an opportunity to witness the signing of the agreement. And I also attended the Calgary Chamber of Commerce lunch. And honestly, the excitement in the room was palpable. And, you know, as a minister who's actually from Alberta, I was actually really proud that the province and the federal government have been able to reach an agreement really when there's been such tensions for a substantial period of time.
But you help me reconcile your optimism and those ovations and the potential for this to boost productivity and GDP and open new markets with all of the cautions that don't overreact, it's only theoretical, there isn't a pipeline proponent just yet, it's just an MOU on a conversation. Both things cannot be true.
So all of the latter comments that you've just said are true. You know, there not in fact a proponent at this point in time, but the agreement does set forward a framework, like I say, that will put the conditions in place to allow all of that to happen. The other thing that the agreement does, and I think built into it, are provisions that address so many of the concerns that people have. They're already articulated, already spelled out in the agreement. And so just by way of example, one of the first clauses in the agreement talks about the fact that both of the parties are agreed on the necessity of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So that's one of the first things that's spelled out in the document. Throughout the agreement, there's reference to Indigenous peoples, to the need to engage, with the need to consult, also the need to include them, Indigenous peoples, in economic development.
But that's law in Canada. That's not something that exists because of this memorandum of understanding, right? I mean, the courts have ruled that there must be consultation, there has to be engagement. It doesn't necessarily have to be approval, but there has to be a process of engagement there. And while, yes, there's an agreement to get to net zero by 2050, the 2030 targets, the 2035 targets, carve-outs on clean energy regulations, you know, a lower carbon price and industrial carbon pricing than what was expected beforehand. I mean, these are the reasons Stephen Guilbeault is not a cabinet minister now, right?
Well, and you know, I very much respect Stephen Guilbeault, and he's certainly a very respected member of cabinet. How I see the agreement, though, is the intertwining of the notion of the pipeline with the carbon capture storage project, the Pathways project, which will be the largest project of its kind in the world, and will in fact remove emissions from a number of oil and gas sites in northern Alberta, you know, liquefy the carbon dioxide and remove it to an area in Cold Lake. And so the focus in the agreement is in fact a focus that is climate ambitious in terms of reducing emissions. And I think that's a really important part of the agreement that people aren't really talking about as much as they should.
Right, but help me understand this. The Prime Minister, Tim Hodgson, and you're all selling the merits of Pathways, carbon capture at scale, the biggest carbon capture project in the world. But the pipeline at this point is theoretical. But it says very clearly that the Canada and Alberta agree the approval of the bitumen pipeline is a prerequisite to the Pathways project. So no pipeline, no Pathways, no Pathways, no pipeline, because they're both contingent. So for Pathways to be real, the pipeline has to be real. If the pipeline is only theoretical, then Pathways is only theoretical.
Right, and so, and what the agreement does, it provides a date by which the province is to put forward its application. So the province will apply to be considered as a designated project under the legislation, and then a decision will be made as to whether or not that in fact happens. So at this particular point in time, there isn't even an application before the Major Projects Office. And so again, the agreement sets out a framework, and many steps need to be taken in order for a lot of the aspects of the broadly phrased agreement to come to fruition.
I know this is about resetting the relationship with Alberta, resetting the relationship with the government of Alberta.
Yes.
But I want to play a clip in this monitor, if I can, Minister. This is a new partnership, and on the day of this new partnership, this is what happened in the Alberta legislature when news broke that Stephen Guilbeault resigned. Just have a listen to this.
This day is full of incredibly good news. We got rid of the emissions cap, Mr. Speaker. We have a new pipeline coming here to Alberta, and we just learned that Stephen Guilbeault has resigned from the federal cabinet. So good news all around, Mr. Speaker. Simply,
I just wonder what you make of that this is supposed to be a new partnership, and this is a cabinet minister in Daniel Smith's government celebrating the resignation on principle of the former environment minister.
Yeah, and you know, that's unfortunate. And certainly, as I mentioned to you, David, I was in Calgary yesterday and met with a number of the Alberta ministers, and they were very positive about this agreement, not flippant in any way. And there was a lot of excitement about the notion of working together and working to build a project that will result in incredible economic benefit for Alberta as well as for Canada. So honestly, you know, my own view is when I was there yesterday, that's exactly how I saw this as you know, an arrangement that will make that will be of substantial economic benefit. And you know, I didn't see, you know, there
was a lot happening yesterday. I know you were traveling, but this is what is happening, right? It's an interesting glimpse into what the relationship still is, right?
Yeah, I don't think that reaction characterizes what, you know, most of the politicians, most of the UCP MLAs and ministers are thinking at this time.
Well, look, there was applause. You're not accountable for their behavior. I just wanted to get your reaction because this is the partnership that is there. But I just wonder, like, I know the push, you talk about the economic potential here, how it's still processed. When people raise the environmental concerns, the conservation concerns, and the concerns raised by coastal First Nations in British Columbia, which it is going to be maybe an impossible sell, the pipeline is called theoretical. But this is a government that wants to build a pipeline to the coast now. This federal government, I mean, Mark Carney's not signing this deal, Tim Hodgson is not having these meetings. This is a government fully committed to doing this if they can find a private sector proponent, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And, but I would add to that, this is a new government, and this is, just the world is in a different place at this time. And so, you talked a few moments ago about what had been decided sort of historically and, the decisions that had been made by the government in years past. But it's, as I say, we are facing a new reality now, and that new reality tells us that we need to be independent from the United States, that we need to find new markets. And I would add to that, the Prime Minister, during the leadership campaign, part of the party's platform absolutely had to do with Canada becoming an energy superpower, not just in clean energy, but conventional energy as well. And, when I knock doors in my riding, that's a platform that I ran on as well. And then I would add to that just in looking at some recent polling, I think that Canadians understand all of this. They understand the economic imperative that we have at this time, the need to diversify. And my understanding, based on a couple of polls I've seen, is that Canadians are really, a lot of Canadians are absolutely in favor of, the development of resources like the Pathways Project and the associated pipeline.
But just as a final question, because I've gone way over time, and I thank you for your flexibility on this, a lot of those Canadians would also be Conservative voters. And the electorate is what the electorate is. And this could potentially change the electoral map in key places like Quebec and the lower mainland of British Columbia, which are pillars of 4 consecutive Liberal governments now. I just wonder how much you worry about that, because there is a ceiling to how much you can grow in your home province of Alberta, which was my home for a period of time in my youth. But there are some vulnerable seats in BC and volatile Bloc Québécois voters who came to the Liberals in the last election who could very easily go back.
So I always worry about things like that, but that said, we are just at the early stages with respect to how this agreement will work. And I think once people realize what's actually contained in the agreement and how it does commit not only Alberta, but Canada as well, to taking certain steps that, as I say, protect Indigenous peoples, allow for, broaden, emphasize the requirement that there be Indigenous economic participation in projects such as this. The fact that the agreement doesn't just talk about a pipeline, it talks about Alberta and Canada continuing to work together on many other projects that will be of huge economic benefit to the country, that will create jobs across the country. And I think, once we move a little bit past the initial reaction to this, I think people will see this and they'll understand how many protections are really, I'm going to use the words, baked into the agreement with respect to the environment, with respect to climate change, with respect to Indigenous peoples, and with respect to the necessity to reach an agreement with the Premier of British Columbia.
Okay, we will see where that goes. Minister Eleanor Olszewski, we appreciate your time. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.